Hi, Dr. Hiver. Nice to see you. Here's Ban Ban saying hi.
Hi, Ban Ban. How are you?
Good. So great to see you.
Yeah, it's a small word. The number of our attendees is still increasing. I think maybe we would have more than 200 or 300, or who knows, we'll see. Okay, it's the time. Yeah, so Phil, before the talk, I would like to do some introduction first. Yeah. Yeah, okay. So hello, everybody. I'd like to welcome all of you to today's talk at Huazhong University of Science and Technology. I'm Li Chengchen, and today we are so honored to have Dr. Philip Hiver to talk about research methods for complexity theory in applied linguistics. And before the talk, I would like to introduce Dr. Hiver briefly. So Dr. Hiver is assistant professor at the School of Teacher Education, Florida State University. He does research in second language acquisition, specifically instructed language learning and its interface with psychosocial individual differences. He's also interested in methodological innovation and the contribution of complexity theory, dynamic system theory to language education research. Dr. Hiver has published more than 40 peer-reviewed articles and chapters in journals including Applied Linguistics, Language Learning, the Modern Language Journal, and Studies in Second Language Acquisition. He is co-author with Dr. Al-Hoorie of Research Methods for Complexity Theory in Applied Linguistics, the same name with today's talk. And Dr. Al-Hoorie, I think he is present in today's talk. 我刚才有看到这个阿里胡瑞博士也在我们的观众席里面 Welcome. He is a joint recipient of the International Association for the Psychology of Language Learning 2020 to 2021 Early Career Scholar Award. 他是2020到2021年度国际语言学习心理协会杰出青年学者奖获得者。He also serves on the editorial boards of the Journal of Language Identity and Education and TESOL Quarterly. He is also associate editor of the Journal for the Psychology of Language Learning. So again, let's welcome Dr. Hiver for today's talk. During the whole talk, my dear audience, please remain muted and silent. 那整个讲座过程中呢，也请我们的观众呢保持静音。Also, if you have any questions, you're welcome to leave your messages to the chat box during or after talk. We are going to have 10 to 15 minutes for questions. Okay, so now, Dr. Hiver, let's get started.
So please tell me if you can see my screen properly.
I have to change my mode. How about others? Yeah, I can see your screen now. Yeah, it works perfect for me. How about others? Yes, okay. Okay, great. Yeah.
All right, so thank you once again, Dr. Chengchen Li, for organizing this talk, and thank you all for joining us today. For me, it's very encouraging to see such strong interest in complexity theory, and especially the link between complexity and research methods for our field. So as researchers, the methods we use often come in a two-part package. On the one hand, there are practical techniques for designing studies, and on the other, there are some underlying assumptions of those research methods we use. So in my talk today, I'll begin by exploring these underlying assumptions about complexity theory research. Looking at these underlying assumptions, it's one way to examine what the realities of the human social world are that we're studying in our research. And then I'll use these ideas to lead into thinking about whether there is a more appropriate approach to doing research and what that might look like for us. But first, let me give you a little background. So here is how everything straightforward in life was ruined for me. In 2010, I became a parent, and this is my 10-year-old daughter, Chloe. And once I had a daughter, I had to learn to live with the unexpected and the uncertain. And you know, the complexity scholar, Edgar Morin, he said that learning to live with complexity, it requires us to learn to navigate, in his words, on a sea of uncertainties. It seems to me that parenting is a daily exercise in navigating on a sea of uncertainties. But becoming a parent was also how I got closer to reality. It makes you realize that life is not simple and clear-cut all the time, and you learn a lot about yourself and the real world. The other thing that ruined everything straightforward for me was doing my doctorate degree. So this was back in the early 2010s. With my co-author, Al-Hoorie, we were studying for our PhDs, and we began to realize if our work was going to have a genuine impact, it would have to deal with these messy realities of the human and social world. And obviously, that includes language learning and language use. So that is how we came to write this book. I think early on as researchers, what we came to realize was we'd been operating as if the things we were researching were similar to this image. You can see this is very neat, simple, and easy to understand. But as the famous essayist H.L. Mencken once said, there's always an easy solution to every problem. Neat, plausible, and wrong. So we began to suspect in our work that what others in the field thought of as conventional research practices, they were actually chasing solutions that were neat and plausible and wrong. And we came to understand that the things we were researching in language education were much more like this. Look at this open intersection. And as you can see at first glance, this scene is very disconcerting. You may wonder how this works. How is it that no one is getting hurt? How is it that this isn't one big accident? But then your sense of worry turns to awe. Gradually, you start to realize that this is a fully functioning intersection. And in some ways, it's a perfectly normal everyday scene, right? This is just how real life is. So as researchers, where do we start? Well, in my experience, when colleagues or my own students who would like to adopt methods of complexity, they come to me and they say something like, I use narrative design, or I use ethnography or ethnographic methods. Is that compatible with complexity theory? So they're often frustrated when I reply, well, what's your problem? What do you want to know? So for me, I think complexity theory research methods, form always follows function. Form follows function just means that as complexity researchers, we need to start with a problem or an issue or a question that needs to be addressed. You see this picture of this man, his name is Ilya Prigogine. He is a Nobel laureate in chemistry. Something interesting he once said was, the starting point of research is astonishment. So even for him, a Nobel laureate, it's not about first deciding what methods to use in his lab. No, he says uncertainty and surprise are central to the research enterprise. And I think sometimes, if we look at what our field does, we lose sight of uncertainty. We lose sight of surprise in our quest for simple, neat solutions that we're chasing in our research. Okay, so assuming we have a well-articulated problem, or we have a good idea of what we would like to know, then form follows function. So we begin to adopt an approach to designing our research. And this is where researchers often start to spin their wheels and spend too much energy on methodological debates. So let's take a few examples. Should our research be exploratory or confirmatory? Can we research outcomes, or should we focus more on processes? Is it legitimate to look at parts, or should we be more interested in wholes? So as Miles and Huberman say, at times the competing arguments of different schools of thought about how research should be done properly consumes more energy than actual research does. So this is something that my co-author Ali Al-Hoorie and I found when we were writing this book. And it's incredibly unfortunate. You know, as the famous saying goes, these debates, these methodological debates, are so fierce because the stakes are so low. And yes, complexity theory research has assumptions, but it rejects these simple dualities, such as parts versus wholes, outcomes versus processes. And here's why. If we're interested in wholes, then chances are we're also interested in the parts that make up the wholes. And if we're interested in complex outcomes, we're also interested in the processes that lead to those outcomes. So this is a slightly new way of thinking about the analytical approach that we adopt. So here, with the analytical approach, here is where we start to get a feel for some of the differences between complexity theory and conventional approaches to research. So this is Cattell's data cube. Cattell's data cube is a simple model, a heuristic for thinking about the dimensions that research designs vary. And it's been around for decades, so nothing terribly new. And you can see the dimensions are individuals, the number of variables or constructs, and the number of occasions, or how often we collect data. So this example on the left-hand side shows a large N study. It collects data for many variables at one time point. So a typical one-shot cross-sectional observational study. Now, on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see a very different design. This design is a small N study, that is a small sample, with many variables. But now it's a high T design. That means data is collected on many occasions, or what we might call a longitudinal study. Now, recall my early insistence on first having a problem. What's your problem? You can see that the first type of study, on the left, it can address certain types of problems. It can provide answers to certain kinds of questions, but not others. For example, this kind of study can highlight general tendencies and patterns of inter-individual variation. But the second type of study, it can address totally different kinds of problems, and it can answer totally different kinds of questions. In this case, a high T design, a longitudinal study, can reveal change over time, and it can also help us understand intra-individual variation. So if we're interested in the analytical approach to research, we also have to take a short detour to talk about the underlying assumptions. We need to know if complexity research operates on similar assumptions as other more conventional research does. So let's take just one example of more conventional research methods and their assumptions. This is a picture of the beach at Cape Canaveral here in Florida. And several times a year, they launch rockets and satellites from here. And so what are some of the assumptions of launching a rocket to the moon? Well, in a moonshot, I think the engineers assume there is a more or less stable environment at the launch site. And engineers also assume that the laws of physics don't change. So when they calculate the amount of fuel, for example, to provide thrust for the rocket, those rules won't change in real time. And everyone, the spectators and the engineers alike, they all know that rockets are designed for a specific purpose, and they behave the same way every time you use them. So these are some of the assumptions that we can see in conventional research designs. But as you see, assumptions are a very slippery slope. As the quote-unquote engineers of research methods, when we design studies, we bring our own set of assumptions that we operate with too. So one basic assumption is that to research something, we first need to take it out of its real environment. And there are sometimes good reasons for doing this. For one, the principle of parsimony tells us that simpler is better. Sometimes less is more. But as I mentioned earlier, when you start to look at these assumptions in combination, you start to see some puzzling things. By taking things out of their environment, we break things up into smaller parts and draw boundaries between things. And then we study things in isolation. Often we also consider things unchanging, and we assume that generally people and processes are identical across contexts. And then we wonder why we're no closer to having a grasp on reality than before. So if you're wondering, how does an innocent child like Tom Riddle on the right-hand side here, how does Tom Riddle turn into the arch-villain, Lord Voldemort? Well, just like with assumptions in research, it's a very slippery slope. So, still thinking about assumptions, one of the assumptions that conventional research operates with, whether implicitly or not, is that we are studying fairly simple systems made up of just a few elements that are also isolated from their surroundings. So, like this pendulum, we can see that because of these few elements separate from their environment, it has relatively predictable behavior. And this assumption, we can see it in a lot of the research in our field. This pendulum is a good example of a simple system because it has a few elements and fairly predictable behavior. So if we know some basic things about the input to the system, how much energy we put into the system, then we can predict the system's behavior and the outcomes for the system. Right? We know exactly where the bob will swing. But the reality is that research in our field, like much of the social sciences, rarely deals with simple systems. So our assumptions are incongruent with the reality on the ground. Now, some research recently has slightly updated assumptions. So let's see what we get here. Well, in these designs, we can see the underlying assumption of a complicated system. Now, what's a complicated system? Well, like the rocket, complicated systems are made up of many components. Many components means these are quantitatively different from simple systems. But still, looking at these systems, we can still understand them by looking at their components. So if we were to break up the rocket into its parts and study its parts, we would understand the rocket's behavior. And so we're back to simple and relatively predictable behavior. But the unfortunate reality is that research in the social sciences and in our field deals mainly with complex systems. Not simple and not complicated systems, complex systems. Now think about most of the things we're interested in as researchers. We're interested in human thought, interaction, learning, and other types of behavior. These things are situated and they are relational. So the individual person relates to others in context, and context is constantly changing. Now this photo at the bottom right-hand corner shows the Spring Festival here in Tallahassee, Florida. This was taken a couple years ago. Now, if you've ever been to a festival, a parade of some kind, you know that the human world is situated, it's relational. And by the same token, in the social world, things are complex. What you see is not always what you get. So the social world can be surprisingly nonlinear because inputs don't always relate to outcomes in simple, proportionate ways. And then to top it all off, processes that relate to human behavior are nothing like a rocket. People change over time. History matters. So the human world is complex and dynamic. So those are a lot of assumptions to work with. Now, how do we begin to think like a complexivist? How do we use these assumptions to our advantage when doing research? Well, the poet Scott Peck wrote this. He said, "I hope you'll abandon the urge to simplify everything, to look for formulas and easy answers. I hope you'll appreciate the fact that life is complex." Now, it's extremely challenging to appreciate the fact that life is complex when, as researchers, we've been trained and conditioned with a set of assumptions similar to that of the rocket and the moonshot, right? But studying the human social world is not rocket science. Our assumptions need to be recalibrated for the complex, dynamic, human and social world that we're studying. So let's try to recalibrate our assumptions now. Now take a look at this really interesting thing here. This is a double pendulum. Instead of one bob, it has two. You can see there's a red and a blue bob. So simply introducing another element into the picture can completely change things. Look at this. First, this system is now made up of interacting components. Okay, because of these interacting components, this is qualitatively different from a simple system. It's qualitatively different. And it's not possible to fully understand its behavior just by looking at the components. We would have to understand their interactions through time to understand the system. Now, this is only the most basic complex system. It has two elements, and there are no human agents, and it's also unclear what the environment can do to influence the system. But even so, when you watch the system run, you can see how quickly things become unpredictable. So as I mentioned, the reality in our field and in most of the social sciences is that we are studying complex systems. A learner, a class, a group, an institution, or some combination of all of these are complex systems. And studying the processes or the outcomes of complex systems, it requires a new way of doing things. So what is this new way of doing things? Well, let's pivot now to doing research, and let's add a couple basic assumptions of complexity theory. So as we've already said, complexity theory takes a systems view as its point of departure, that we're studying complex systems. And we can add to this the relational principle and the adaptive principle. What are these? Well, complexity theory tells us the reality of the human and social world. First, everything counts and everything is connected. That's the relational principle. And second, everything changes. And that's the adaptive principle. So what do these principles mean for broad research? Well, if we're interested in focusing on processes of change, one way of doing that through the adaptive principle is using dynamics-dominant research. So dynamics-dominant research uses time-intensive methods. And we can focus on change, development, self-organization, and emergent outcomes. Of course, complex systems also have parts. So another basic approach is relation-dominant research. And in relation-dominant research, we describe systems' parts and their interactions, and we focus on complex structures and relations in the system. Now, the idea of dynamics-dominant or relation-dominant research is very abstract, and examples are always worth more than explanations. So let me very quickly give you some examples. If we start first with the complexity theory way of thinking, the conventional way of designing research, here are some examples of the research questions the field has been asking. So over several decades of research, we have some idea of the answer to these questions. For example, we know that anxiety tends to correlate at the negative 0.3 level with language achievement. But in retrospect, we can also say that this kind of research, these questions, operate based on underlying assumptions that aren't compatible with complexity theory. So the idea that things are simple, few in number, that they are separate from the environment, and relatively predictable is not compatible with a complexity understanding of the social world. But if we take a new way of thinking, it provides new insights in two ways. First, the types of research questions that we can ask are completely different. And the second way is the types of evidence that we collect and the types of results and the answers that we achieve are also completely new. So for example, we could ask, how does learners' willingness to communicate change as they perform a task? Or what happens to learners' anxiety over the course of task-based classes? So there's the possibility in complexity research to structure these questions around the relational principle or around the adaptive principle, or a combination of both. And it's subtle, but you can see the underlying assumptions are there, that there are many components interacting, that they are linked to their surroundings, and they change in ways that are not totally predictable. So some more examples. Remember, the relational principle says, things don't exist on their own. Phenomena only make sense in relation to other phenomena. So if we were to structure research questions or a research project and design it around the relational principle, this is an example of what it might look like. So we could ask, how are learners' cognitions about L2 interaction and their emotional engagement related to their actual interaction behaviors? And this is actually a question being researched by one of my early stage doctoral students here at FSU. So that's the relational principle. Now here is the adaptive principle by itself. Remember, the adaptive principle says, over time, playing the game has a way of changing the rules. Everything changes. So this means we have no idea what time 5 will look like until we get there. It depends on what unfolds before it. Time 1 with time 2 and time 3, time 4 combined lead us to time 5. So if we were to structure a research question or an entire design around the adaptive principle, this is an example of what it might look like. How does an engaged learner's task performance predict their learning gains over a semester? So this is the adaptive principle. And when we combine the principle that everything counts and everything's connected with the other principle that everything changes, things start to get really interesting. So this is where the field has started to go. We're seeing some really interesting studies. For example, one by my doctoral student, Ashley Zhou, looking at a reciprocal dual process of student engagement, how language teachers affect students' engagement, and then how those students in turn affect teachers' classroom teaching over the semester. Of course, as things start to get more complex, you begin to get a headache and you start to wonder whether you wouldn't be happier going back to your conventional way of doing things. The idea that things are simple, few in number, separate from the environment, and relatively predictable, that's a safe way of doing things. But something starts to happen. you often find that there's no going back from a complexity way of thinking. It just isn't satisfactory, and it just doesn't capture reality in ways that do it justice. So with these new assumptions, you start to experience what's called cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance means the methods you're adopting conflict with the assumptions underlying complexity theory. And then, of course, there's the issue of dimensions. So when we think that everything is connected to each other, if cognition and motivation and emotion and behavior are part of a human system, this raises what Diane Larson Freeman calls the boundary problem. The boundary problem can be summarized this way. If everything's connected to everything else, how can we study anything? So this is a larger problem, and maybe we can circle back to it later in the talk. But for now, the short answer is that, once again, form follows function. Any parts, any processes, any boundaries that are part of the research design depend on what you want to know and what is being explained. And when it comes to scale, there's also an important consideration. The question here is, what's the appropriate unit of analysis? What's the appropriate timescale for explaining something like language learning? And there are different possibilities. The appropriate level might be something like the development of learner language over several months. Or on the other hand, if we look at a more fine-grained timescale, we can imagine looking at changes in patterns of language use in a single task. And a single task is a timescale of minutes. So, having spent some time thinking about the assumptions, let's move on to the methods. Remember that the basic premise so far is that complexity is an empirical reality of the human and social world. It's just a basic fact of life. And if we're interested in what methods the field has used over the past 25 years, since complexity was introduced into the field, we can see that the uptake has continued to accelerate. It's even been faster than in related fields, such as education and pure linguistics. We can also see important contributions that complexity research has made in many strands of our field. So considering that there's a growing interest in complexity methods, it makes sense to evaluate what designs and methods the field has used till now. So let me introduce a very brief systematic review that we conducted. And these are the questions we were interested in answering through this project. We were obviously interested in the methodological characteristics of previous complexity theory studies. We wanted to note the trends and the tendencies in the designs of these previous studies. We were also interested in the substantive contributions. And finally, we wanted to know if there were any limitations, any areas for improving study quality. So basically, question 1, what have people done? Question 2, what do we now know that we didn't previously know? And question 3, where do we go from here? So our initial search, it spanned a period of 25 years. And you may be wondering, why 1994? Well, believe it or not, 94 is the first date of the very first contribution on this topic delivered by Diane Larson Freeman in a conference speech at the Second Language Research Forum. So our search covered different types of sources. We had articles, book chapters, conference papers, and doctoral dissertations. So obviously, 2,300 plus reports is too many. So we further refined these 2,000 reports by looking at these inclusion criteria. Now, inclusion criteria are important simply because they help to focus the scope of a review. So in order to be eligible as one of these papers we were including, they had to had to satisfy these criteria. 2 is especially important. The study had to basically identify itself as being informed by complexity theory research. So then we narrowed it down to 400 plus reports, and we inspected these manually. And then we kept only 158 reports that satisfied all 5 criteria. And you can see from this graph here, the year-by-year breakdown of complexity theory research in our field. Our team coded these reports, and we used a detailed scheme that included things like study design, study length, and study limitations. So let me share what we found. What has the field done so far? Well, starting with the characteristics of participants in these studies, we can see there are a handful of studies including larger samples, but roughly 40% of studies have a sample size of 10 or less. And when combined with other design characteristics, we can see this, it marks the importance of individual-based designs and ideographic research. Clearly, studies with younger participants were in the minority. You can see that there are 112 studies that sampled university students or adult language learners. So the rarest kind of complexity research are studies with language learners who are 7 or younger. Now, we also saw a wide range of research contexts in this study pool. You can see that foreign and second language learning accounted for the majority. It was 132 studies of the total. There are also various instructional settings that are part of this pool. In addition to the 79 studies that took place in generic instructed language classrooms, a handful of studies were online, some in immersion, and some in study abroad environments. Now here you can also see something puzzling. Even though there is an importance of context in complexity theory, the number of studies that didn't specify the research context or the instructional setting is slightly worrying. And you can see the participants also represented various L1 backgrounds and target second languages being learned. Okay, turning to study design characteristics, we looked at the general approach to study design and the timescale of data collection. So you can see here, over a third of studies were cross-sectional, and more than 53% of studies were longitudinal. You can probably see that 53% in relation to the field more generally, this seems like a much higher proportion of longitudinal studies. So it also shows the importance of studying change and dynamism. And looking at study length, we can see that data collection, it took place most often over a time span of months. So there's something really interesting here. Study length in this pool of studies, it ranged from 90 minutes to 4 years. And that is the duration of the study. But something that wasn't really clear was the frequency of data collection. So we looked, but mostly the details about the frequency of data sampling weren't specified in these studies. The one difficult thing here is it made it difficult to determine if a study with a time span in weeks collected data daily or only once at the beginning and again once at the end. So looking at the broad design choices, we also looked at the study aim, the unit of analysis, and the method chosen. So we can see here, over 80% of studies were exploratory. That's quite a few. And only 28 studies incorporated some form of hypothesis testing in their design. We didn't find any study that combined these two. And just for objectivity, we coded this idea that a study was confirmatory or exploratory from the research objectives, not based on claims the author made that their study was confirmatory or exploratory. And the unit of analysis was also fairly straightforward. In 73 studies in this group, it was the group level. And in 70 other studies, it was the individual. There were a very small number of studies that combined these, that had more than one unit of analysis in the study. Okay, and related to that, the choice of method, it was split across qualitative and quantitative studies. So we tried to be as inclusive as possible in our definition of the method used, and we thought of things such as the purpose, the focus, and the design or procedures of the study. We found that a large number of studies here were purely qualitative studies. I think what might be going on is it might reflect a trend for newcomers to complexity research to apply methods that capture rich, dense data sets. So we saw, for example, that roughly 80% of dissertations in this pool of studies drew heavily on qualitative designs. Closely related to the design decisions that we just talked about, here are some of the choices related to data collection and data analysis. So if you look at this table, you'll see that we found a range of techniques that were present in these studies. I think what's notable is most studies in this report pool included multiple complementary data sources. At least 2, but often up to 4 sources of data were combined in a single study. I think this reflects a general tendency to approach data collection with a more is more mentality. I mean, if everything counts and everything's connected, then by extension, we must need more data to investigate that. I think the jury is still out on whether more is more or less is more in complexity research. But I think still, going back to my earlier idea, what's the problem should always be the starting point. For me, that's got to be the overriding factor in choosing how to collect data and how much to collect. So a couple examples for analyzing data. Some of the qualitative analysis included content analysis, ethnography, thematic coding, discourse analysis, and grounded theory. We also saw 15% of studies adopt dynamic statistical analysis. New methods such as the coefficient of variation, Monte Carlo modeling, min-max graphs, growth curve modeling, time series analysis. A lot of new and exciting methods are being applied. And of course, the last objective of this review project was to look at methodological rigor. I'm sure, as many of you are aware, this is a growing trend in our field to really scrutinize study quality. So we were just as interested to see what were the areas for improving study quality going forward. Some of the biggest design issues we found are related to the data and the analysis. On the one hand, it seemed often data and data analysis were inappropriate for investigating change and development. For example, I think it's not hard to imagine why a study that has a single round of interviews or cross-sectional data at 1 or 2 time points is not the best to investigate complex connections or dynamic change. So for us, from this very brief review project, what's become clear is that our research community is developing new ways of thinking. And these new ways of thinking are accompanied by new methods. These new methods give our targets and objects of study a new framing. And what we're seeing here is examples, on the one hand, of the underlying assumptions that we talked about earlier, and on the other hand, the methods that match those assumptions, they're being brought together in practice. So to revisit the question that we set out to answer earlier, what has the field done so far with complexity research methods? We can see that the field is slowly expanding the methodological toolkit beyond conventional methods, and many scholars are developing a new expertise in new designs, and these are initiatives that the field should continue to pursue. So clearly from that brief review, both quantitative and qualitative methods play a big role in complexity research. And you can see from the cover of our book, we're advocating a many doors approach. There are many ways to get there. And we'll explore some of those doors here today. But of course, we need to acknowledge the fact that introducing new research approaches frequently leads to different reactions from the research community. One big reaction is the tendency to reject new approaches and reject them because they're too risky, they're too difficult, and too difficult to learn and apply. And the second response might be the tendency to reject something as nothing new. So although in our book we kept this distinction between qualitative and quantitative methods, it's clear that complexity theory research draws on both qualitative and quantitative data, and it looks at both the individual and the group level, and it can serve an exploratory and a confirmatory function. So the great news is that complexity research, it has something for everyone. Now, I just want to take another short detour to talk about the kinds of criticisms that some individuals with a superficial understanding of complexity sometimes have. So any serious complexity researcher should be clear, complexity research is intended to be useful, just like all good research is intended to be useful. But some critics, for example, tend to say complexity research, it's unable to make any predictions. It's not compatible with hypothesis testing. It can't explain underlying causes, and it's unable to say anything generalizable. Once again, in my experience, these criticisms, they're born out of a lack of understanding. In fact, complexity theory research does enable us to make probabilistic predictions. And complexity theory research is well suited to hypothesis testing. For example, it allows us to falsify previous exploratory research. Complexity research also takes a unique perspective on causality, and it explains causality in ways that are multi-causal, interrelated, and reciprocal in nature. And finally, complexity research allows us to particularize. We can say what works with a specific focus on for whom, in what settings, under what conditions, and when. So keep in mind that complexity research must be useful in the way that all good research must be useful. All right, so let's get into it for real now, and let's look at some of these methods and how they actually work. I'll start by looking at two: retrodictive qualitative modeling and the ideodynamic method. So first we have retrodictive qualitative modeling, RQM. Now we all know what predictive means, but what is retrodictive? Well, retrodictive simply means looking back at what came before to help us understand now. And since this method is not intuitive for everyone, let's start by thinking about disciplines that use this kind of research by default. So I remember in college, I was made to read Charles Darwin's Voyage of the HMS Beagle. Has anyone read that? Maybe it had some historical significance, I'm not sure. But it was clear to me the HMS Beagle had no personal significance, not to me. Until recently, when it actually struck me what Charles Darwin was doing as a scientist. He was essentially retrodicting from present evidence. In his case, it was these finches, these birds you can see here. And through a backwards analysis, Darwin was constructing a model of how the natural specimens he had came to be the way they were. And of course, he termed that the theory of natural selection. So Darwin may have been one of the first to use RQM as a formal method of science. Another more contemporary example is archaeology. And what's archaeology? Well, archaeologists, they study human activity through the recovery and analysis of materials and artifacts. So archaeologists always begin with an outcome, an identifiable outcome in the present, and then they use that to look back and to study history, or even prehistoric societies, when there are no written records of the past. So the name retrodictive qualitative modeling is catchy, but it's a slight misnomer. In fact, it's not exclusively qualitative. It's a mixed and multi-method, and it doesn't rely on formal modeling. And for that, we can blame the originator, Zoltan Dernier, who incidentally was our doctoral supervisor. So what is RQM? Well, RQM is a stepwise sequence of functional procedures. So you can see that it begins in step 1 with identifying a qualitative outcome that the system is settled into. So that's the Q. And then in step 2, the researcher inductively collects evidence to trace a path backward in time. That's the R. And finally, step 3, the researcher constructs a model to understand the development that brought about this outcome. So that's the M. And what is this sequence for? What's it useful for? Well, the aim of RQM is to identify some typical and prominent outcomes in an area of action or some topic of interest, and then to explore these outcomes and what makes these outcomes and their development unique. So the first steps of RQM are to identify the system outcome, or the states that we're going to investigate. So for example, we can think of various patterns or tendencies that we can see in the world around us, or in data that we'd like to explore. And then we purposively sample individuals or cases that are typical of those outcomes, that are typical of those patterns. And it's important to remember, even though the world is complex, these patterned outcomes that we're interested in, they're not infinite. They are limited in number. And we can think of these as attractor states. The technical term is attractor states that the system settles down into over time. So once we've sampled typical cases of those outcomes, we turn to data collection. And the data collection techniques, they involve a detailed description. For example, we would like to elaborate on the characteristics of those outcomes. What makes one personality type different from another personality type? And we can accomplish this through a range of data sources. You can imagine using focus groups or interviews, self-report surveys, or other observational types of data. And step 3, obviously, just looking at the system's outcome, it's only one part of the picture. And some would argue that the outcome is not the most interesting part. So this is why describing the components and describing the system is only half the job. So in the final step of RQM, the researcher traces development using data with some time series in order to build up an understanding of how the system came to its outcome. So here's an example of RQM. Now, since I work in teacher education, I happen to be interested in language teachers and the impact they have on students. So I began with a big question, here it is, and that was, how do language teachers maintain their instructional effectiveness and professional stability, even though there are many demands on them in the classrooms where they work? So you can see already from my big question, I'm going to be looking for outcomes that are typical of instructional effectiveness or typical of professional stability. So remember, the initial step is to identify system outcomes that we'll investigate. And with the methods, the idea here is to cast as wide a net as possible. We want to know what's out there. And I did this in my study with focus groups. I sampled focus groups with language teachers and teacher educators as widely as possible, and it resulted in lots of data that I coded to explore this outcome of teaching effectiveness and professional stability. So I described these examples and I elaborated on the typical cases. So this initial stage, I learned something. And what I learned was language teachers developed a kind of psychological quality which functioned as a protective factor. And I called this teacher immunity. Well, what's teacher immunity? Well, it's a robust defense that protects the self, the teacher, against undesirable impacts. So from this first step, I knew that teacher immunity settled into one of two configurations. There was a productive and a maladaptive outcome of teacher immunity. So I dug further. Remember that in this second step, I was interested in finding specific cases that were typical of these outcomes. And here I used cluster analysis to help me do that. So the logic of RQM is that every subsequent research phase builds on the design of previous phases. So cluster analysis, in this case, builds on the focus groups from the first stage. And the working backward from the outcomes helps to understand the process that led these teachers to these different outcomes. So think of cluster analysis in this study as giving us profiles. And you can see how specific groups were different from each other. These were the specific constructs, such as resilience, classroom emotion, and self-efficacy beliefs. So I identified multiple clusters, 6 or 7 of them, and I was able to show how they were meaningfully different across these different dimensions as I analyzed these two different outcomes, a productive or a maladaptive teacher immunity. And then once the main outcomes of teacher immunity were identified, I shifted my attention and I was interested in the patterns of development. So how did teachers come to be visionary? Or how did teachers come to be a sellout? And I did this by selecting the most typical participants for each outcome, and I conducted in-depth interviews and class observations. And this resulted in a huge data set, of course, and there was an important time series to it. Where had they come from? And how had they gotten to where they were? So this step, it allowed me to understand how teachers could end up in one of these prominent outcomes of teacher immunity. So here are just a few questions, the kind of broad research questions we can ask using RQM. For example, what are emergent outcomes that are possible for a system? What is the system doing right now? What kinds of factors produce different outcomes for a system? How did a system come to be what it is right now? How did a system adapt and change to reach its current state, etc.? Now, obviously, all of these general and broad research questions can be further focused and refined with specific targets that you're interested in. For example, how did an anxious student come to be anxious like they are? How did a student with high willingness to communicate develop into that type of profile, etc.? Okay, moving right along, we're looking now at another method. And earlier I mentioned that a lot can change when we choose a specific scale or when we change the level that we are studying. So now here's something quite interesting. This author, Nassim Taleb, he's quite a polarizing author. Not everyone likes him, but he said something interesting about the importance of scale. He says, at the federal level, I'm libertarian. At the state level, Republican. At the local level, Democrat. And at the family and friends level, I am a socialist. Now, here's what he meant. In reality, when it comes to human behavior and development, it's often the context or the scale that's the most important thing. It determines how people think, how we feel, how we act. And this simple fact, it means that many attempts to find simple, universal rules of human behavior, they are doomed. They fail because they ignore scale and the fact that scale determines everything, how we think, feel, and act. So one of the pioneers of research methods for different scales is Peter Molnar. I believe he's a developmental psychologist at Penn State University. And in a paper he once wrote, he said this: to really study processes that unfold within individuals over time, we need to observe the processes as they're taking place. So to illustrate, he shows a simple study where a researcher collects data, for example, on motivation here, at several different time points over a year, on day 1, day 200, and day 400. Now, as researchers, we might think we've done our job. We're looking at how motivation unfolds over time, and you can see the drop is relatively steep. And of course, this demonstrates a general trend. If you're asked to do something repeatedly, generally, your motivation will decrease for the task. So on day 1, you're more motivated. On day 200, you're less motivated. And by the time you get to day 400, you just want to end. You don't want to keep on going. Now, what's curious is Peter Molnar says collecting data at different time points can show something completely different. So you can imagine, as we increase the measurement occasions, the number of times we sample data, that these data, they reveal new patterns completely. New patterns that were not part of the picture when the data were just at 2 or 3 time points. So you can see in the last example, if we sample data every day for 400 days, there are wild fluctuations, but there's also a general stable trend of increasing motivation. So we're interested in scale, and what methods are available if we're interested in scale. One of them is the ideodynamic method. Now, unlike some conventional methods that average data from a group and try to find a central tendency or the group level variability, the ideodynamic method is much more interested in individual level, the individual level of outcomes and the processes. So this is Peter McIntyre, and you can see he says something about ideodynamics. He says ideodynamics addresses questions about patterns of change within an individual that can't be addressed with other research designs. So when the complexity researcher zooms in on one learner, an important consideration is the time scale of the investigation. And we saw from the brief review of methods I presented, the time scale can vary a lot, from minutes all the way to years. So when it comes to smaller time scales, researchers need a new method to collect accurate real-time data. For example, during a specific language task. And the ideodynamic method was developed just for this purpose. So let's get specific. The ideodynamic method involves recording a learner's speech, their interaction, or their performance, and then showing the participants and showing others the video of their performance to collect stimulated recall ratings about their speech or their interaction or their task performance. So here's an illustration. Imagine that Mr. Tim Cook, the current CEO of Apple, responds to an ad recruiting participants for a study on anxiety. Okay, so despite his busy schedule, the researchers videotape him giving a public speech. And in phase 1, he conducts the speech while videotaped or being recorded. And right away, the audio or video is loaded into the software. So here on the left-hand side, you can see some of the most commonly used tasks in this kind of research so far. They tend to be monologic, which means there's no interaction. But the presence of a video is very important. By using a recording, we have a cue to the participant to help them remember what they were doing. So we can avoid relying just on memory, and the quality of memory is open to a lot of bias. Now in phase 2, the participant is asked to watch the video of their speech or of their task and listen to the quality of their production and provide ratings on specific variables. So these could be psychological variables like willingness to communicate, anxiety, or they could be linguistic variables, competence, fluency, lexical complexity. Now, as the example I'm going to show, these ratings can be done several times using the same data, but with different variables. So the same data with overlapping variables. And we can incorporate self-ratings, interlocutor ratings, or expert ratings. Okay, now in the next phase, the software graphs the reactions, and it provides a quantitative measure for the variable of interest. Remember, in this case, it's Tim Cook, and the variable is anxiety while speaking. So using stimulated recall, then the participant is asked to explain their ratings. You know, why were you so low here, but so high there? And this is qualitative data. So the software, it generates a graph and an Excel file of their ratings, and the qualitative data collected from the stimulated recall, it can be transcribed by the researcher for further analysis. So here's an example of what that looks like. Remember, this is step 1. The participant is asked to complete a speaking task, and as you do, you can see that there's a lexical repair in their speech. I'm really expecting to meet you tomorrow. Sorry, I mean, I'm really looking forward to meeting you tomorrow. So in step 2, they're asked to listen or watch what they did and rate their performance. There are a variety of measures here. You can see there's competence, the novelty of a task, the coping potential, their word choice, and the pleasantness of the task. So you can see that during the lexical error, the competence appraisal went down, and at the per second level, it then quickly recovered and went back up. So this unique aspect of the ideodynamic method is it allows us to look at the ratings on a second-by-second scale for this task in a very systematic manner. All right, so let's look at an example study, what that would look like. This is an unpublished study. The data was provided by Peter McIntyre, and it looks at the effects of conversation strategy instruction. So the idea is that for newcomers, for second language users, it takes a while to develop your language skills, but something almost immediate it can help you communicate is nonverbal strategies. And nonverbal strategies are things that can help clarify meaning during interaction. So the researchers had 10 participants, beginning level ESL students, and who were asked to complete a basic persuasive speaking task. Convince your partner to come to your home country for tourism. And they completed this twice, once before the nonverbal strategy instruction and once after nonverbal strategy instruction. So you can see in experimental studies like this, the researcher deliberately manipulates certain factors, like the type of instruction or the difficulty of the task. And when we manipulate these factors, we can investigate, I guess, their effects on outcomes of the task. So here are some of the data. This figure shows competence appraisals, just one variable, by the speaker themselves. So these are self-appraisals. And you can see the data showed significant increases in competence appraisals for some participants, but not for other participants. In fact, these three, participant 4, participant 3, and participant 7, their self-appraisals were so low, it was almost worrying. And now, depending on the purpose of investigation, researchers can perform a horizontal analysis. A horizontal means we compare patterns across participants. And we can ask what was different in the first three compared to the last three participants. So that's a horizontal analysis. Alternatively, we can perform a vertical analysis and we can focus on individual patterns. How did participant 10 gain so much self-competence after the nonverbal strategy instruction? So here's a slightly different figure. Now this figure shows others' competence appraisals, so ratings by the interlocutor. And again, we could perform a horizontal analysis, or we might perform a vertical analysis to focus on patterns in each individual. So here's an example of a vertical analysis. When we focus on patterns in an individual, we have real-time, per-second data. And a quick visual comparison, we can see that participant 10, the student's ratings didn't go above +3 in the pre-training task. So before nonverbal strategy instruction, they didn't rate their competence very highly. But after training with nonverbal strategies, not only was there much more variability, the ratings were much higher. They stayed in the +2 to +5 range. So this might indicate that the participant benefited from the nonverbal strategy instruction, and they were able to use these in their communication. And as a result, they rated their own competence much more highly. Again, what accompanies this is rich qualitative data that provides a first-hand account, an explanation for what's going on in these quantitative measures. Now, the ideodynamic method has been around for about a decade, and this first decade of use, it's given us some insight, some interesting methodological lessons. First, one drawback of this method is the amount of data is enormous and it's quite messy. Remember, it's on a per-second timescale. So especially with a large sample of participants, it's possible to have more data than you know what to do with. The other thing is these data are very idiosyncratic. They're very contextualized. Look at the first one, for example. You can see that the individuals' ratings are all in the minus territory, but 4 observers rate them quite highly. So we need to consider how to link these disparate results to theory and practice. How do we reconcile the speaker's very low ratings on this task with the observers' somewhat high ratings of their performance? The other thing is that the ideodynamic method is kind of artificial, and participants, they report when you're videotaped in a lab, it feels sort of unnatural. So one recommendation for further research is to try to explore, is it possible to do ideodynamic studies in natural settings, such as the classroom? So once again, here are some broad questions, the kind of research questions we can ask when using the idiodynamic method. So how do self-ratings change over the course of a task? How do self-ratings relate to others' ratings? What factors influence these ratings and perceptions? In context, are there factors that influence it? Experimentally, what's the effect of training or instruction on ratings of performance? And how do self-ratings relate to other more objective, direct, or physiological measures? And also, does the type of stimuli, the kind of recording, have an effect on the learner's self-ratings? That's an interesting methodological question. Okay, so we're moving on to another method now, and this is the experience sampling method. Now, the originator of this method is none other than Mike Csikszentmihalyi. He's the founder of flow theory. So in studying flow, he stressed the need to take two factors into account. Csikszentmihalyi said, first, individuals' experience is complex and idiosyncratic. And second, experience is structurally dynamic. It's constantly changing. So this is why the experience sampling method collects very situated and very time-dense data. So this time-dense data is genuinely one of the best ways to study the temporal aspects of human functioning and human behavior. So the very first published report using ESM was conducted by Csikszentmihalyi and two of his graduate students in the 1970s, and it was a study of how teenagers spend their waking hours and how they change their activities over the course of a week. So what did his experience tell him, or what did it allow him to learn? Well, he said, ESM, experience sampling, is a means of collecting information about the context and the content of human life. Much like a newspaper reporter gathers information on who, what, where, and when, ESM provides a record of the landscape of daily life. So why is a psychological method like experience sampling compatible with complexity theory? Well, what people do in naturally occurring contexts, that means in everyday life, it actually reveals a lot about the complexity underlying human thought, underlying human feelings, and development. So the reason ESM is compatible with complexity theory, it's because it captures these interconnected elements and the interactions that bring about some important outcomes. So what does this method look like in practice? Well, the most characteristic feature of experience sampling is that it prompts individuals to respond at regular intervals. So for example, individuals could be asked to report on their affective state or their level of alertness throughout the day. Each time they're signaled to, they would respond how they're feeling and what they're doing. So these repeated measures result in a type of data that allows us to model the change that's happening in individuals. Often when we refer to sampling, we're referring to participants, but a little bit of clarification here. In ESM, sampling doesn't refer to participants. In this method, sampling experience means we are collecting data at repeated occasions, at multiple time points. So you can see, for example, we could collect data once a day for a week, or every couple of hours during a day. So depending on the time scale we're interested in, the idea is to collect a relevant and a representative sample of experience, but using the right time intervals to understand what we want to understand. So in the first case, it's 4 times per week, or in the second case, 10 times per day over multiple days. Again, depending on the problem or the issue or the question we have. So how does ESM collect or sample experience? How does it get its name? Well, the way it does this is it asks individuals to give systematic self-reports. And it does this at regular intervals, which is called interval contingent sampling, or it asks participants to do so when they are signaled. That's called signal contingent sampling, or following a certain event. For example, after every meal, every time you go out the door, and that's called event contingent sampling. Now, the way it does this usually is with a smart device. You can imagine a PDA, a cell phone, or some kind of smartwatch. And on the right-hand side, you can see what the researcher uses to collect this experience. On the right-hand side is what's called an experience sampling form. So an experience sampling form kind of looks like a contingency table, right? A process table. It prompts the individual to respond about a topic from start to finish. And you can see from this experience sampling form, this researcher, they would collect data about the context the individual's in, the specific emotions they're experiencing, and whether and how well they're coping with those emotions. So this experience sampling form is probably from a study on coping strategies or situated emotions. Now, the great thing about ESM is that we can use what we already know. A variety of question formats can be used. For example, we can imagine students responding to semantic differential scales about their emotional mood. So how alert or drowsy are you? How relaxed versus how anxious? How confused are you? How clear are you? How involved versus how detached are you? Or we could use Likert style items. We could ask students to respond about how challenging, how satisfying, or how interesting they found the classroom task. And finally, we could use free response. We can ask students to indicate what they're doing, who they're with, and what their interaction is about every time they are signaled. Now, although it's very flexible, experience sampling is best used to measure dimensions of immediate experience, immediate episodic experience. What is episodic experience? Well, it's questions about real time, in the moment. Things like this. How do you feel about your performance right now? And these tend to be context dependent. Generally, experience sampling avoids measuring global or retrospective dimensions. And the reason we avoid retrospective or global dimensions is because the present time and the present context are much less relevant to those things. All right, now, unfortunately, there are very few examples of experience sampling in our field. Recently, there have been a couple, but here's an older example from educational psychology. Now, remember my 10-year-old daughter, Chloe? Well, it's very important to me that she likes math. It's very important to me that she does well at math. But there's this very unfortunate finding in academic emotions literature, and it's that despite similar grades, girls typically report much lower academic self-concept and much higher anxiety in math than boys do, despite similar grades. So these researchers in Germany, with Thomas Goetz here, they began with an interesting question. Do girls really experience more anxiety in mathematics? And they looked at this question by comparing experience sampling data in the moment, assessment of emotions, with classical trait assessment of these constructs. So you can see here from these figures, their review of previous literature shows in both test-related settings and classroom-related settings, girls do seem to experience more anxiety in mathematics. But that was using only trait-level measures of anxiety. So their objective here was not just to uncover gender differences in math anxiety, they wanted to contrast situated state-level reports in the moment, real-time experience with those conventional trait-level reports that are affected by subjective beliefs. So in their study, they selected two to four students from many different classrooms, a random selection of students from over 40 classrooms. And they had hundreds of students who completed a self-report trait level anxiety scale. And then over the next 2 weeks, in the math classrooms, they collected measures of situated real-time math anxiety at random times. So all the students were given a PDA and they were signaled an average of 5 times each class. And here's the interesting thing they found. They found that in test settings and classroom-related settings, the real-time, in the moment, anxiety that students felt didn't differ. It didn't differ between the genders. It was only at the trait level where anxiety seems to be influenced by others' beliefs and our own internalization of those beliefs. That's where girls reported much higher anxiety than boys. So this seems to be a pretty important finding, that in the moment, during math class, or in a test experience, that situated anxiety is no different across genders. And by contrasting these, they were also able to show some interesting cross-gender differences in the duration of emotions and the type of emotional change. And they showed shifts in experiences across the two genders. So they were able to capture some cross-gender differences, but they weren't the simple kind of predictable things you would get from a trait-level conventional study. So here are just a few broad ideas, the kinds of research questions that we can ask when using experience sampling methods. We can ask, how is human behavior shaped by environmental influences? And you can see from the example, in the moment math anxiety is no different across genders. So they were able to capture these kinds of questions. Or how do individuals experience distinct activities? In certain settings, what outcomes emerge? Or how do individuals differ from one another in the way they experience similar situations? When we look at certain behaviors, what kinds of change are part of these experiences? Remember, we're collecting sampling experience many times, and that allows us to kind of model processes of change. And then in a setting, what links can we find between thoughts, feelings, and actions? If everything is connected and everything counts, then we can look at those things using ESM2. So we're coming full circle now. We've looked first at some of the assumptions of complexity theory research. We've looked at what the field has done so far, and I've introduced a couple of forward-pointing templates for research. So we should probably think about where this takes us. Why would anyone adopt an approach to complexity research? What do we stand to gain from doing things in a new way? What does it allow us to do? And here, David Byrne, the British complexivist, he says that there are some core objectives for complexity research. It allows us first to understand complex systems. It also allows us to understand patterns of change, trajectories of development. Third, it allows us to trace and model the complex mechanisms by which these patterns arise. And the last one, it seems to me, is the one that we haven't really done well as a field. But looking at what's been done so far, we've got a pretty good start on the first three objectives. It seems to me that if we are able to do all four of these things, then complexity research in language learning has been enormously successful. So we'll see about the fourth objective going forward in the future. You all probably know Stephen Hawking, and surprisingly, he was very prescient because in the year 2000, before he passed away, he said this. He said, "I think the next century will be the century of complexity." Well, in our field, it's been around over 2 decades, and the advance of complexity theory research has not slowed down. Now, one nice diagram I like to study is this diagram. You may have seen it. It's created by Brian Castellani. He's a professor of sociology at Durham University in England, and he's constantly updating and developing it. Now, I remember first seeing this diagram at an early stage before he added the 2010s to this. But since then, the links have gotten denser and the topics have become more comprehensive, and you can even see at the bottom, he's added a completely new line. This new line is all about complexity theory research methods. So here's the exciting thing. Not only has our field caught up with the rest of social sciences and what they're doing with complexity theory, our field is now starting to be a net contributor to the complexity sciences. Now, if you look carefully, we don't yet have any scholars from our field on this map, but I bet it's only a matter of time before they show up. So to me, this is exciting because we see this dynamic development of the field. And as we continue to learn, we'll give back to the complexity sciences. We'll no longer be a net importer of ideas. We'll actually be contributing to complexity science. So let's start to wrap it up. Because some of the insights and guidelines for complexity theory research can be quite abstract and they can be overwhelming, what I'd like to finish up with is a kind of summary or a synthesis of some methods lessons that can help to point the way forward. And here I'll refer to these as tenets or lessons. So no matter what the method, complexity theory research in a single study should provide a clear rationale for why adopting a complexity theory research perspective is a good choice. Why would you do that? Well, providing an explicit rationale can help you guard against opportunistic, trendy, bandwagon applications of complexity theory. Additionally, complexity theory research should articulate how the theory informs the design and methods. Remember, form follows function. We don't begin with a method and think, how can I apply this to the question? We begin with the question and the methods follow from there. And doing this can help us to show how a study draws its ideas in the design from complexity theory. And it will help us avoid saying that anything with multiple parts or anything changing in time is complexity theory. It's not quite that simple. Another lesson is that complexity theory research should specify the aims, specify the unit of analysis, and specify what is under investigation. Is it an outcome or is it a process? When it comes to the nitty-gritty, when we do complexity theory research, we should adopt methods of data collection and analysis techniques that come from the aims, the unit of analysis, and what we're investigating. So it helps us to ensure that The methods we adopt can help us to answer the questions we're interested in addressing. We won't get research that collects random data which is not suited to connections in context, or collects data that's not suited to studying change. Complexity theory research also should specify carefully the role of context in what's being studied. It's become a truism. Everyone knows that context helps us explain development, and things change in context. But when we articulate exactly how context helps us understand, we can more accurately build an account of evidence that others can build on, evidence that others can falsify and extend in their own work. This is important because, remember, complexity theory research must be useful, just like all research must be useful. So, what are the takeaways for the field? In conclusion here, it seems to me one big takeaway is we need to begin by embracing the fortunate reality of the human and social world. We are fortunate to be working in a field where things are not simple, not linear, and not predictable. It makes life interesting. It makes what we're doing as researchers worth pursuing. Another important takeaway is we now have ample methodological guidance. There is now guidance that points the way forward. And even though it's only been a quarter of a century, and complexity theory is still a relatively new paradigm, we can see that there are more mainstream acceptance of complexity theory. So if our field builds on this, and if we adopt the methodological guidance that's out there, then complexity theory, it will continue to push the field forward and provide valuable insights to language learning and language development. And that brings me to the end of my talk.
Hi. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think it's about 1 hour and 40 minutes without a stop. Yeah, thank you so much. And I think maybe the audience need more time to articulate or type their questions to the chat box. And before that, I would like to make a short summary for the talk. And after that, all the questions are welcome. 各位老师、各位同学呢，那我现在简单的做一个简短的总结。那在这期间呢，大家有什么问题啊，想和我们的 Dr. Phil Hiver 交流的话呢，欢迎大家把自己的问题打到对话框。好 ，OK。So I was really inspired by the talk, and I think Dr. Hiver is not only a good researcher, but also a good observer. He observes things around him and combines them with his own research. And Dr. Hiver is not only an excellent researcher, but also an excellent teacher. And as we all see in his talk, he started with his daughter and 3 examples, rocket, moonshot, and pendulum, to emphasize the advantages and importance of the complexity theory. He also addressed the important principles or relevant criticism of complexity theory in a very engaging way. He shared his systematic review of what has been done in this field. He also showcased 3 typical CDST methods, which is quite useful. Yeah. And he also shared with us the core objectives and directions of the field. In all, the talk is very inspiring, thought-provoking, and quite interdisciplinary. And we all know, as Dr. Hiver said, how the theory informs the methods. I really appreciate your efforts and time in the preparation. Yeah. So now I think there are some questions. Yeah. Yeah. Can you see here? Phil, can you see the questions?
So Cheng-Chen, would you like me to look at the questions and answer them?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I can see that many have asked what the name of our synthesis article is. The synthesis article is a systematic review, currently under review, and we hope to have it out before the end of summer. So hopefully you'll have access to it very soon. One question asks whether a series of semi-structured interviews can help explore development or change in student engagement. Yes, I think they can. And I know they can if the question is correct. So for me, it's not, we need to adopt interview methods because that's what we do and we have expertise in interview methods. It's more, if we would like to know about the individual students and their experience in the classroom and how they engage, then we have to interview them. We can't collect that data any other way. But of course, we would like to know something about processes. So we would need interviews with a time series element. Interviews over time, for example, 30 minutes every week. Talk to the students and see what they're doing, how they're engaging. And what do we pay attention to? I think the interview gives us individual data, so we should pay attention to particularities. Not think, okay, this student is typical of every individual, but think, in their own right, this individual has something insightful to say about student engagement. So I think that's what my intuition tells me is what interviews are good for with studying change in student development. Another question is whether concept mapping, which we introduce in our book, is an effective way of exploring influencing factors. I think what concept mapping helps us do is understand everything at play. If we want to know about a phenomena, concept mapping tells us this is everything at play, everything that's happening. So yes, it can help us explore influencing factors. But immediately the caveat is concept mapping is not very useful for development. It doesn't help us trace change through time. It simply helps us understand the complex interactions of components at one time. Jack Yu has a very interesting question about when we are conducting qualitative studies, how can we justify the use of complex methods? And I think here the thing is we should come to the research question with a genuine open mind. Will we see phase shifts? Will we see self-organization? We don't know. But we shouldn't try to shoehorn complexity concepts into the research data we have. We shouldn't approach a research setting looking for self-organization at all costs. If we don't see phase shifts, they're not there. If we don't see self-organization, then we're missing something. But we shouldn't immediately assume we will find these things. We've got to actually look for them and be genuinely surprised when we find them. How can we go further to explain these studies rather than describe? So to me, what the field has done really well so far has been to describe things at a metaphoric level. What we need more of is intervention, experimental studies that help us understand how these complex things unfold. So for example, when we provide instruction, what happens? The studies that we've had so far basically look at yes/no questions. Do we see an increase in uptake when we provide explicit output prompting feedback? Yes, we do. But we have no idea the mechanisms behind that. We have no idea what happens. And we need further kinds of experimental studies to help us understand these causal mechanisms. So I think that's at the cutting edge of what the field is doing now, trying to go beyond description into explanation of underlying causes.
Okay.
Looking, I'm not seeing any new questions other than that.
Yeah, so any other questions?
So we do have another question.
Yeah.
Is the combination of RQM and corpus-based methods effective to explore development of students' writing? I think it would be. If you think about what RQM wants, it asks us to begin with an outcome. So what's the outcome? Is it the student has developed into an advanced writer, or they are not developing writing competence? So we begin with that problem, and we use the corpus data. The corpora allows us to look at where they've come, the kinds of writing products they've produced, to kind of really dig into the details about their development. And remember, development doesn't only mean progress towards a higher outcome. It could also mean stagnation, retrogression, that is getting worse. So yes, corpora are very useful because they provide actual data, direct sort of snapshots of what a writer can do. So absolutely, I'm on board with that.
Okay, thank you for questions. We still have some minutes for questions. If you have, don't hesitate. Yeah.
CAF. So a very interesting question about CAF. So complexity, accuracy, lexical, and fluency measures, CALF, are some of the most direct measures of development. And they've been used across SLA for years, right? These discrete measures, they give us a kind of idea of the quality of language production. So we can say whether someone's complexity, lexical or syntactic complexity, is developing. I think one of the points that complexity researchers have made, and I'm thinking here of the Dutch researchers Marjolein Verspoor, Van der Looy, and their colleagues in the Netherlands, the CAF measures have to be appropriate for the kind of discourse. In other words, if we're looking at written discourse, we need to use the appropriate CAF measures for writing, not CAF measures for spoken discourse. The other thing is that we have no idea really how these CAF measures interact. So the first would be domain specific, skill specific, that is, and then the interactions between these CAF measures. So some of their work looks at, for example, competition between CAF measures or coordination between CAF measures. But again, there's a lot of work that can still be done. And I think the new research that they're looking at is still individual case-based longitudinal designs, looking at new measures of CAF to try and find how they interact together over time.
Okay, so thank you very much. Yeah, we still have another question from our institute chair, Professor Feng Xuefang. Yeah, from our university. Yeah.
So the question is, what's the difference between complex dynamic systems theory and complex network methods? So remember that the overriding theory is complex dynamic systems theory or complexity theory, whatever term you like. And then to me, that network methods, social network methods, are a method that can be used to study complex connections. So one of the chapters in our book is about social networks. And the idea that everything is connected, it's pretty intuitive. We're only several steps apart from each other, really. But how do you study networks? Social networks or complex network methods allow us to do that. What are the connections we have in terms of our relations? What information passes between us? And how does this network our connections change over time. So yes, for me, network methods are part of, or they're a method that can be used to study things using the CDST theory. The question here is, what research methods would you recommend for L2 listening? Think aloud protocols? Once again, I know I'm going to sound like a broken record, but form follows function. So think aloud protocols are appropriate if they match the question you're asking. Development of listening skills. Listening competence might involve a lot of hidden, I think there are 19 or 20 psychological processes involved. And listening is a black box. So if we would like to get at what's happening inside the individual during listening processes, then yes, it seems to me that think aloud is quite an appropriate method. But again, it would follow from the question, what do you want to know? Does think aloud help you to find that? I can see Ting Huang says that variability is a big part of complexity theory. I agree. I think one of the biggest things we get using complexity theory is we can capture variability that conventional methods ignore, or conventional methods gloss over because they are noise or something that we need to average out. Winnie asks, when we explore an outcome, how do we allow for all the factors or interactions being grounded from the data? So this brings us back to the boundary problem. Diane Larson Freeman, she makes this point well. If everything's connected, if everything counts, how do we stop ourselves from studying the whole world? And so the boundary problem can be solved by looking at what we're interested in explaining. So here's a parallel example. The human body is connected in certain ways through physical systems. But if we're interested in the mechanics of holding a pencil, we will only look at the hand. We'll look at the fine motor skills of grasping with the fingers. Right? We're not interested in the digestive system or the lymphatic system. We have a boundary that comes with what we're trying to explain, the grasping system of the fingers, fine motor skills. Now, if we change that and we want to explain a baseball pitch, we need to expand our boundaries. We can't understand a baseball pitch by studying fingers. We need the shoulder. We need a throwing motion. So we can expand our boundaries and our focus by taking a wider or narrower lens, depending on what we're trying to explain. So the first step is, what's the outcome? What's the state? And if you're interested in a very broad state, you need to take into account more factors than a more narrow state, which is analogous to just grasping with fingers, for example. And by the same token, when it comes to time and history, it's very difficult often to basically delineate where we begin, because all of history is important. Your whole life determines who you are now and your behavior. But clearly, if we're studying task performance at a minutes or seconds time scale, we're not interested in your childhood, not so much. We're more interested in recent history, probably your learning experience or the time scale of the classroom or the course itself. Someone asks, for RQM, retrodictive qualitative modeling, does the typical trajectory of change between clusters, is it a prototype or a typical outcome? So that's a good question. Remember, RQM has several steps, and it's only the last step where we really focus on trajectories of change. So I think we have to begin with typical outcomes in order to understand change. I don't think they're the same thing. I think by separating them, we can keep things systematic. What kinds of emotions do we see in humans? And how do you develop to become a happy, optimistic person versus someone who is a bit more, right, with negative emotions? Very interesting question. Someone asks, what do you expect an explanatory research paradigm to be like if there's no such research at present? So I think this is something that still stumps me. I'm still working on an answer to this, and I think many scholars are. In our field, as an applied field, we're interested in lessons, takeaways, applications. And especially for language teachers, we want to know, so what? What now? What can we do with this information? And so far, complexity theory hasn't given us those takeaways or those lessons. So we have teachers, and you can talk to a teacher about the classroom being a complex place, and they'll nod their head. They know it is. Their existence embodies complexity, but they want to know something more. What can they do about it? How can they grapple with that complexity? And so that explanatory research, I think that's what we're looking for. Here's an example. What initial conditions and what classroom parameters are those that allow us to generate engagement for students? There are going to be multiple conditions, multiple parameters, and some students will benefit from some students will benefit from others. And we'd want to know a kind of template, almost a complex template for what to do that can explain how students become or regain their engagement. Okay, another question is, what are the advantages of experience sampling in comparison with semi-structured interviews? All right, so remember, semi-structured interviews are self-report data, which means already they're one step removed from these. So their experience sampling is in the moment, repeated measures of experience. So every 5 minutes, I buzz you on your phone and I ask you, what are you doing? Who are you with? How do you feel? There's a kind of immediate, direct observation that you don't get from a semi-structured interview. So that would be the first thing, I think. The second is that the timescale differs. You can't do a semi-structured interview every 2 minutes in a task. It's too obtrusive. But it's inobtrusive. It's much more convenient to buzz someone every 2 minutes during a class and say, just rate on a scale of 1 to 10 how you're feeling and how you're doing right now. So the time scale is completely different. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. Thank you, Phil. Thank you for your talk as well as your answers to the questions. And it really inspires me a lot. Yeah, thank you. I think it's almost the time, 2 hours non-stop. Amazing. Yeah. Okay. So if you have more questions or further questions, maybe you can send email to Dr. Hiver. Yeah, and so thank you again, Dr. Hiver, and thank you everyone for your participation tonight. Yeah, good night and good morning to Phil. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye. Okay.